Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here. I wanted to redo the video about Kamala James Harris because when I did the original video when he first passed away in August, it was kind of rushed. The news was unexpected, and I really wasn't able to do it properly and correctly and really express how much I enjoyed his work as a wrestler. And plus, like I said, and I said this with Road Boy Animal, who just passed away um, like a couple of days ago. I grew up as a fan of the WWE. So what I saw from Kamala and Animal and a bunch of other wrestlers was just WWE stuff and a little bit of WCW as well. Mainstream professional wrestling. What came before me, so this is why I didn't really do a video about Bullet Bob Armstrong, who also passed away like a month or so ago, was because I didn't experience really his run, and now I have to go back and look at his run. What I knew about his run was mainly from his sons, um, Brad Armstrong and Road Dogg. So, because his run was Smoky Mountain Wrestling, which was out of my range, other than Jim Cornette, the Heavenly Bodies, and the Rock and Roll Express, and the Georgia, Northern Florida territory, which was also um, not only before and in the 70s, but before my time and also out of my watching range. I just I really will know about the WWE in the 80s and 90s. And with Kamala, it was similar. Like I said in my other Kamala video, I remember the casket match from Survivor Series 1992. And I remember his run mainly in 1992. I didn't really experience his run in the mid 80s when he came in and he fought Hulk Hogan and he was managed by Classy Freddie Blassie. But since I made that video a month ago, I went back and I looked at him and his stuff that he did in Mid South and his stuff that he did in the Memphis territory where he debuted. And I must say, I underestimated the impact of his character. Like I said, I always loved his character in WWE because he was so committed to kayfabe, or that wall of illusion that exists between the fans and the wrestlers. That the wrestlers, even when they were out in public, they would make believe that the gimmick that they portrayed was real. And for Kamala, it must have been hard because he couldn't really go out in public and speak and articulate himself to the general public because his gimmick was that he was a Ugandan headhunter and that he didn't speak any English. You know what I mean? So when you have a gimmick where you don't speak no English and you got to go around and have other people like Harvey Whippleman or Classy Freddie Blassie or Skandar Akbar, who I didn't really know that much about. Skandar Akbar, I knew the name, but again, he was mostly a manager in the Dallas territory and in Louisiana. But from going back and reading Kamala's book, um, Kamala Speaks, that he came out with in a couple of years ago, I think like 2015 or so. I gotta look at when the date was. I learned a lot about his relationship with Skandar Akbar, and the connection really sort of made sense because the character of Skandar Akbar was a rich Arab, not like a crazy Arab like the original Sheik, but a rich Arab who brung in this African headhunter to the Louisiana slash Dallas area. And like I was looking at the faces of these people as Kamala walked through the audience and just the shock of the looks and amazement that the people were in just because the size of them. And then like I always assumed that his work was just like doing the chops and slapping his belly because that was what he did in WWE. He didn't really in the WWE, especially in those days, you weren't really allowed to show your range of what you could actually do in the ring. Even if you were a big guy like Kamala who could do a leapfrog. And he actually talks about in his book the 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 first time he did a leapfrog. He was wrestling Kerry Von Erich, the Texas Tornado, who in the Texas area, in the Dallas, Texas area, was the most over babyface slash good guy in the area because he was the son of Fritz Von Erich who established the territory. I mean, not even established the territory, but he was the most popular star, and he bought the territory. And Kerry Von Erich was his son. Kerry Von Erich was his only son that went on to go to the WWE. But when he and Kamala wrestled, um, Kamala said, I mean, Kerry Von Erich called a leapfrog, and and Kamala was like, "You're gonna give me a leap? You're gonna give me a leapfrog?" He says, "No, you're gonna do the leapfrog, Jim." And Kamala was like, "I don't know if I could do it," and he did it. And then later, when he came to the WWE in 1984, he actually did the leapfrog over um, uh, Hulk Hogan. you, you know, and then like I learned a little bit too from reading the book about his life and how his life was so sad prior to becoming a professional wrestler, during the time he was a professional wrestler, and especially after he retired from wrestling in 2011. First of all, his life before becoming a wrestler was he was born in Mississippi in the 1960s. I mean, in the 1950s rather. Grew up in this, born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s, and he experienced a lot of course, a lot of racism and a lot of discrimination, being that he was African American during the civil rights movement. But he talks about in the book how he would start to see the sea change in society. Um, when Martin Luther King uh, was out there preaching, because being that James Harris was from Mississippi, Martin Luther King, of course, was assassinated in 1968 close to Mississippi in Memphis. And James talks about how he was working on a farm and he heard about this and how it changes perception, you know. of his place in society because he had always perceived himself as inferior because of the prejudice that he had faced. And in his early part of his life, it created a lot of bitterness towards society. He talks about how he got into professional wrestling too. That originally he drove trucks, and he was talking to his sister's boyfriend, and the sister's boyfriend said, uh, you know, why didn't you get into? He said I could get into professional wrestling, and he had originally been a fan of wrestling. He talks about in the book how he was a fan of Boris Malenko. He talked and Eddie Graham and how Boris Malenko and Eddie Graham had this one fight where all of Eddie Graham's teeth were completely knocked out. And Boris Malenko, of course, is the father of the Iceman Dean Malenko, who in the '60s he portrayed a Russian Russian communist gimmick, I guess, in the Memphis area, and then or Florida. I think it was Florida because well, Mississippi, Florida, the Florida Panhandle, that area where James had grown up. And then he talks about how he went to Michigan, and it was in Michigan that he decided to become a wrestler, and he trained under Bobo Brazil. And Bobo Brazil is a very significant name in African American professional wrestling history because what he's considered to be, as it were, the Jackie Robinson of professional wrestling because um, he was one of the first African American superstars ever in any of the territories, and he mostly worked and promoted in the Detroit area. His feuds with the Sheik are famous, so Kamala was trained by him. So originally, Kamala was called Sugar Bear Harris because that was his name when he played high school football. They called him Sugar Bear, from the cereal, from the cereal, the cereal mascot. So he worked at Sugar Bear Harris, and he talks about too how he wrestled in Germany, how it was different in Germany when he wrestled compared to when he was in England. He talks about what it was like to wrestle in England. When he went over there in the '70s, when he was known as the Mississippi Mauler, and he wrestled one of the biggest legends in English wrestling, Big Daddy. Big Daddy, he talks about how Big Daddy basically did nothing in the ring. He just stood there. He talks about how he enjoyed the food in places that he went, like Mexico, and how he really enjoyed the food in Germany. And he even tried to learn some German when he was over there in wrestling in there. But in 1982, he comes back to the United States because he broke his ankle. And it was there in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was visiting a friend of his, who was the Dream Machine, a wrestler called the Dream Machine. I'm not too familiar with him, but Jim is visiting this guy, and Jerry Lawler, who, again, like I said, every professional wrestling territory had their mainstays. Um, like Big Daddy was England. Jerry Lawler was the Memphis territory, Eddie Graham was the Florida territory, especially southern Florida, but a little bit in northern Florida too. And Jerry Lawler was the guy in Memphis, and he had come across this article in National Geographic of these the bodyguards of the president of Uganda at the time, Idi Amin Dada, who you could see his life portrayed in the movie Last King of Scotland. Um, by Forrest Whitaker. But anyway, he has the idea to come up with this Ugandan headhunter gimmick for James, and he does it. And the first night there in 1982, Kamala completely defeats um, Jerry the King Lawler by disqualification, and people are immediately shocked, and people immediately bought into this gimmick. Kamala talks about how he go around and people be like, ask him, "Are you still wrestling? Are you still wrestling?" Because he was well known in the Memphis territory before he had gone to overseas. That's where he started out, the Memphis territory. His second territory that he really worked at. And people be like, "You're still wrestling, you're still wrestling," and they be like, "Don't go down to Memphis because we'll run into a thing." They called Kamala, and they didn't even know that the lady didn't even know that she was actually talking to the real Kamala because he didn't have the face paint on. You know what I mean? So he stays there for a while, and then from there he moves on to the Mid South territory. Now, the Mid South territory was a very unique territory because under the leadership of Bill Watts, who took over the territory from a blind guy, Leroy McGurk. A lot of um, African American stars were featured in the territory just because Bill Watts was promoting in Louisiana, Mississippi, that kind of area, and he understood that if he had the African American stars, both the good guys and the bad guys, um, it would draw the African American fan base in. And the biggest star of that area was the Junkyard Dog, the JYD Sylvester Ritter. And of course, Kamala was brought in to work with the JYD, and they had a lot of great showdowns, a lot of great matches that they drew a lot of heat. Because again, Kamala was this monster coming in, and the JYD was a beloved hero of the people of Louisiana, of the Louisiana territory. So they had this battle of the monster matches, and they were pretty good matches. And it was the JYD who had given him the name Wally Wally, because when Kamala would get hit, he would sell like this. He would wobble, before he would fall down. So JYD gave him that name, Wally Wally, and he had the most success in this part of his career. He talks about in interviews how it was the Junkyard Dog who, quote unquote, bought him his home and his mom, because Bill Watts paid him fairly, treated him like a star, got him over in the territory big time. I even saw every wrestler had this specialty match. This specialty match was the Ugandan Death Match. They would later debut when he moved to Minnesota in the American Wrestling Alliance. But the Junkyard Dog specialty match was the dog collar match. and Kamala and Ted DiBiase were a tag team against Dusty Rhodes and the JYD in a combination bull rope and junkyard match. And this and dog collar match, this match was so bloody and so hard hitting. Man, I watched this and I was just blown away. You would never see this kind of work in the WWE back then, and even especially now. You know what I mean? It was just a really good, hard hitting type match. And then from there, he moves on to the AWA. He didn't really do much in the AWA, but he did debut his Ugandan Death Match specialty. And then he goes to the World Wrestling Federation. And it was in the World Wrestling Federation, like I said, where he got to work with some of the top stars. But he does complain, that he really never really got paid as much in the WWF, in the big time, like he did in other companies and other promotions. And he even went to Hulk Hogan and complained to him like, "Wait, we're both working the main event together. Why are you getting more money than me?" And Hogan tells him basically, "Get what you can, brother, because I'm getting what I can." And because he didn't really get a good payoff like that, he left the territory and he went to back to Memphis. And again in Memphis, he was very successful the second time around, because the first time around they brought in uh, well, many of you will remember this guy's run from the mid '80s in WWE was Uncle Elmer, uncle to Hillbilly Jim, but they brought him in the Memphis territory to be Kamala too, and basically kill off James's gimmick, because if this guy who we knew as Clyde Frazier was already working as Kamala, then we knew that Kamala's gimmick was a bunch of bullshit. And come on, white Kamala, it doesn't really work. you know, So the first time they tried to kill him off, but he came back the second time, and he worked a couple of matches with Jerry Lawler, matches with Superstar Bill Dundee, and then in 1992, Vince McMahon calls him back, and Vince promised him that it would be different the second time around, that he would get paid more the second time around, and he would be featured more in main events the second time around. It wasn't to be. Like I said, he had the match with Undertaker, the casket match, the match at SummerSlam 1992 in front of thousands of people at the Wembley Stadium. And it was in this match that James would often talk about that he did not get paid as much as he would have liked. He was told by his manager, Steve Lombardi, a.k.a. the Brooklyn Brawler, that who was his Kim Chi, his handler, that he was paid, the Undertaker was paid $500,000, and James only paid like 20,000 or whatever. And he attributed that to the racism in the WWE, and he even talks about how Vince McMahon would make him eat in a separate room and to be segregated from the other superstars. And he felt like that was kind of a racial slight against him. So he stays with them until he turns babyface in 1992. He turns on Harvey with him and his manager, and then Slick becomes his manager, and he tries to stabilize him. They got a lot of bowling vignettes and everything with him bowling, him doing other activities. But James says he really didn't like to work as a babyface. His character worked more as a heel, as a villainous type character that people were scared of. But when they tried to make him into a comical type babyface, and they do this a lot with a lot of wrestlers. Like you'll see guys come in as scary type heels, like Great Khali, for instance, is a great modern example. The Great Khali come in and he would be a villain and then turn him into a heel, comical. George the Animal Steel was a villain in the '60s, scary that would scare the audience, and then they turned him to a good guy, and he was just mine, all kinds of stupidness. So they did that to Kamala, and he was supposed to wrestle Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 9, and he just walked out of the company. He was involved with the Dungeon of Doom in 1995 in WCW, but again, he claims that Eric Bischoff didn't pay him and that um, he didn't even speak to him, and he wasn't getting paid at all. So he left the company, and you know, uh, he was gone from mainstream wrestling. He came in and out of um, WWE. He said he got paid really good when he came back at WrestleMania 17 for the Gimmick Battle Royal, in which he was eliminated by Sergeant Slaughter. But it was his life after wrestling that a lot of people will always remember him too for, because unfortunately he suffered a lot of complications with diabetes. He really didn't take care of his health really well, and he would go on to even sue the WWE for um, injuries sustained, but it was thrown out of court in 2015. And yeah, like his story of becoming a double amputee as a result of diabetes really struck me, because it made me see, like, I wish the WWE would have a better system to take care of these wrestlers when they are out of the limelight. Like him and Coco Beware, both guys, complained that WWE wasn't really doing enough really to look after them after they had faded. I mean, I know they look after certain wrestlers, like ones that have drug problems, like Jake the Snake Roberts or Sonny or Scott Hall or whatever. But Kamala didn't really have those problems. He had other types of issues, and you know, WWE really just abandoned him and really wrote him off after he was done from there. And what I think about the character as itself, I love the character of Kamala even back then before I knew really about the scope of his whole career, because you know it was unique. It really inspired a lot of emotions in people. You know, um, fear. You know what I mean? But also, I think if the character existed today, it would he would make a better babyface today than he did back in the day, because a lot of people are into African stuff and Afrocentric type stuff. So the character could be perceived as like an African type warrior rather than just a cannibal. And it'll kind of be like an African type superhero, kind of like an original version of like the Black Panther or whatever, and would kind of be like, you know, an African superhero, basically, an African Superman in a babyface type way, more than it would be perceived was perceived in those days in a negative kind of connotation. Kind of like um, back in the day in '97, Nation of Domination was considered heels, but now you have an all African American faction on TV right now, the Hurt Business, that is baby faces. So perceptions change over time, and I think Kamala's use of Afrocentrisms was ahead of his time when he was doing that in 1993 as a babyface. I know he really didn't like to work as a babyface, but it could have worked if it had a different spin on it. Because it was played for laughs and it wasn't really taken that serious. He could have used it as an African hero as opposed to just a comical type babyface. But it really did work as a heel. It really inspired a lot of emotions in fans, especially young fans. And that's what I talk about when I say that I love the wrestlers that had the larger than life gimmicks. The ones like Sting, the ones like Kamala, the ones like even Papa Shango. Even though Papa Shango was like a voodoo master and he did the stuff with Ultimate Warrior where he spit out the black tar in '92. It was kind of comical, and later he went on to become the Godfather. But at that time, that's those are the kind of things I really loved about wrestling was that you could see these characters that had a lot of animation to them and a lot of life to them that you couldn't really see in other forms of entertainment. Anyway, rest in peace to Kamala, the Ugandan Giant. And I'm glad I did a full retrospective on him rather than what I was able to do the first time around with his video. Stuff was just coming in. I hadn't really done a lot of my research of his time and his legacy outside of the WWE, and you know, I wasn't. It was kind of late that day, and I wasn't really able to do the video fully like I wanted to. So I hope you guys enjoyed my retrospective on the Ugandan Giants, the mighty Kamala, and I recommend his book, Kamala Speaks, because it really gives you a peek behind the man, James Harris, that he was.